Hello, Slumber Seekers, and welcome to the Slumber Tales podcast, where we read to you some of our favorite stories. My name is Finian Schwartz, and I'll be your storyteller tonight. If you have a favorite story that you'd like us to read, share it with us. You can leave a comment if that's available, or email us at myslumbertales@gmail.com. That's myslumbertales@gmail.com. Now, without further ado, let's jump into our story for tonight. The 101 Dalmatians by Dodie Smith. Read for you by Finian Schwartz. Chapter 1. The Happy Couples. Not long ago, there lived in London a young married couple of Dalmatian dogs named Pongo and Mrs. Pongo. Mrs. had added Pongo's name to her own on their marriage, but was still called Mrs. by most people. They were lucky enough to own a young married couple of humans named Mr. and Mrs. Dearly, who were gentle, obedient, and usually intelligent, almost canine at times. They understood quite a number of barks, the barks for "out please," "in please," "hurry up with my dinner," and "what about a walk?" And even when they could not understand, they could often guess, if looked at soulfully or scratched by an eager paw. Like many other much-loved humans, they believed that they owned their dogs, instead of realizing that their dogs owned them. Pongo and Mrs. found this touching and amusing, and let their pets think it was true. Mr. Dearly, who had an office in the city, was particularly good at arithmetic. Many people called him a wizard of finance, which is not the same thing as a wizard of magic, though sometimes fairly similar. At the time when this story starts, he is rather unusually rich for a rather unusual reason. He had done the government a great service, something to do with getting rid of the national debt, and, as a reward, had been let off his income tax for life. Also, the government had lent him a small house on the outer circle of Regent's Park. Just the right house for a man with a wife and dogs. Before their marriages, Mr. Dearly and Pongo had lived in a bachelor flat, where they were looked after by Mr. Dearly's old nurse, Nanny Butler. Mrs. Dearly and Mrs. had also lived in a bachelor flat, as there is no such thing as spinster flats, where they were looked after by Mrs. Dearly's old nurse, Nanny Cook. The dogs and their pets met at the same time and shared a wonderfully happy double engagement. But they were all a little worried about what was to happen to Nanny Cook and Nanny Butler. It would be all right when the Dearlys started a family, particularly if it could be twins, with one for each nanny. But until then, what were the nannies going to do? For though they could cook breakfast and provide meals on trays, meals called a nice egg by the fire, neither of them was capable of running a smart little house in Regent's Park, where the Dearlys hoped to invite their friends to dinner. Then something happened. Nanny Cook and Nanny Butler met, and after a few minutes of deep suspicion, took a great liking to each other, and they had a good laugh about their names. "What a pity we're not a real cook and butler," said Nanny Cook. "Yes, that's what's needed now," said Nanny Butler. And then they both together had the great idea. Nanny Cook would train to be a real cook, and Nanny Butler would train to be a real butler. They would start the very next day and be fully trained by the wedding. "But you'll have to be a parlour maid, really," said Nanny Cook. "Certainly not," said Nanny Butler. "I haven't the figure for it. I shall be a real butler, and I shall valet Mr. Dearly, which will need no training, as I've done it since the day he was born." And so, when the Dearlys and the Pongos got back from their joint honeymoon, there were Nanny Cook and Nanny Butler, fully trained, ready to welcome them into the little house facing Regent's Park. It came as something of a shock that Nanny Butler was wearing trousers.
"Wouldn't a black dress with a nice frilly apron be better?"
suggested Mrs. Dearly, rather nervously, because Nanny Butler had never been her nanny. "You can't be a butler without trousers," said Nanny Butler firmly. "But I'll get a frilly apron tomorrow. It will add a note of originality." It did. The nannies said they no longer expected to be called Nanny, and were now prepared to be called by their surnames in the correct way. But though you can call a cook, cook, the one thing you cannot call a butler is butler. So in the end, both nannies were just called Nanny Darling, as they've always been. After the dogs and the Dearlys had been back from their honeymoon for several happy weeks, something even happier happened. Mrs. Dearly took Pongo and Mrs. across the park to St. John's Wood, where they called on their good friend, the splendid veterinary surgeon. She came back with the wonderful news that the Pongos were shortly to become parents. Puppies were due in a month. The nannies gave Mrs. a big lunch to keep her strength up, and Pongo a big lunch in case he should feel neglected, as fathers of expected puppies sometimes do. And then both dogs had a long afternoon nap on the best sofa. By the time Mr. Dearly came home from business, they were wide awake and asking for a walk. "Let us all go for a walk, to celebrate," said Mr. Dearly, after hearing the good news. Nanny Cook said the dinner was well ahead, and Nanny Butler said she could do with a bit of exercise, so off they all set along the outer circle. The Dearlys led the way, Mrs. Dearly very pretty in the green going-away suit from her trousseau, and Mr. Dearly in his old tweed jacket, which was known as his dog-walker. Mr. Dearly wasn't exactly handsome, but he had the kind of face you don't get tired of. Then came the Pongos, looking noble. They could both have become champions if Mr. Dearly had not felt that dog shows would bore them, and him. They had splendid heads, fine shoulders, strong legs, and straight tails. The spots on their bodies were jet black and mostly the size of a 2-shilling piece. They had smaller spots on their heads, legs, and tails. Their noses and eye rims were also black. Mrs. had a most winning expression. Pongo, though, a dog born to command, had a twinkle in his eye. They walked side by side with great dignity, only putting the Dearlys on the leash to lead them over the crossings. Nanny Cook, plump in her white overall, and Nanny Butler, plumper in a well-cut tailcoat and trousers, plus dainty apron, completed the procession. It was a beautiful September evening, windless, very peaceful. The park and the old cream-painted houses facing it basked in the golden light of sunset. There were many sounds, but no noises. The cries of playing children and the whir of London's traffic seemed quieter than usual, as if softened by the evening's gentleness. Birds were singing their last song of the day, and further along the circle, at the house where a great composer lived, someone was playing the piano. "I shall always remember this happy walk," said Mr. Dearly. At that moment, the peace was shattered by an extremely strident motor horn. A large car was coming toward them. It drew up at a big house just ahead of them, and a tall woman came out onto the front door steps. She was wearing a tight-fitting emerald satin dress, several ropes of rubies, and an absolutely simple white mink cloak, which reached to the high heels of her ruby-red shoes. She had a dark skin, black eyes with a tinge of red in them, and a very pointed nose. Her hair was parted severely down the middle, and one half of it was black, and the other white. Rather unusual.
"Why, that's Cruella de Vil," said Mrs. Dearly. "We were at school together. She was expelled for drinking ink."
"Isn't she a bit showy?" said Mr. Dearly, and would have turned back, but the tall woman had seen Mrs. Dearly and come down the steps to meet her. So Mrs. Dearly had to introduce Mr. Dearly. "Come in and meet my husband," said the tall woman.
"But you were going out,"
said Mrs. Dearly, looking at the chauffeur who was waiting at the open door of the large car. It was painted black and white, in stripes, rather noticeable. "No hurry at all. I insist on your coming." The nannies said they would get back and see about dinner and take the dogs with them. But the tall woman said the dogs must come in, too. "They are so beautiful. I want my husband to see them," she said.
"What is your married name, Cruella?"
asked Mrs. Dearly as they walked through the green marble hall into the red marble drawing room. "My surname is still de Vil," said Cruella. "I am the last of my family, so I made my husband change his name to mine." Just then, the absolutely simple white mink cloak slipped from her shoulders to the floor. Mr. Dearly picked it up. "What a beautiful cloak," he said. "But you'll find it too warm for this evening." "I never find anything too warm," said Cruella. "I wear furs all the year round. I sleep between ermine sheets, don't you know?" "How, nice," said Mr. Dearly politely. "Do they, wash well?" Cruella did not seem to hear this. She went on, "I worship furs. I live for furs. That's why I married a furrier." Then Mr. de Vil came in. He was a small, worried-looking man who didn't seem to be anything besides a furrier. Cruella introduced him and then said, "Where are those two delightful dogs?" Pongo and Mrs. were sitting under the grand piano, feeling hungry. The red marble walls had made them think of slabs of raw meat.
"They're expecting puppies,"
said Mrs. Dearly happily. "Oh, are they? Good," said Cruella. "Come here, dogs." Pongo and Mrs. came forward politely. "Wouldn't they make enchanting fur coats?" said Cruella to her husband. "For spring wear over a black suit. Oh, we've never thought of making coats out of dog skins." Pongo gave a sharp, menacing bark.
"It was only a joke, dear Pongo,"
said Mrs. Dearly, patting him. Then she said to Cruella,
"I sometimes think they understand every word we say."
But she did not really think it. And it was true. That is, it was true of Pongo. Mrs. did not understand quite so many human words as he did, but she understood Cruella's joke and thought it a very bad one. As for Pongo, he was furious. What a thing to say in front of his wife when she was expecting her first puppies. He was glad to see Mrs. was not upset. "You must dine with us next Saturday," said Cruella to Mrs. Dearly. And as Mrs. Dearly could not think of a good excuse, she was very truthful. She accepted. Then she said they must not keep the de Vils any longer. As they went through the hall, a most beautiful white Persian cat dashed past them and ran up the stairs. Mrs. Dearly admired it. "Oh, I don't like her very much," said Cruella. "I'd drown her if she wasn't so valuable." The cat turned on the stairs and made an angry spitting noise. It might have been at Pongo and Mrs., but then again, it might not.
"I want you to hear my new motor horn," said Cruella as they all went down the front steps. "It's the loudest horn in England."
She pushed past the chauffeur and sounded the horn herself, making it last a long, long time. Pongo and Mrs. were nearly deafened.
"Lovely, lovely dogs," Cruella said to them as she got into the striped black and white car. "You'd go so well with my car and my black and white hair."
Then the chauffeur spread a sable rug over the de Vil's knees and drove the striped car away.
"That car looks like a moving zebra crossing," said Mr. Dearly. "Was your friend's hair black and white when she was at school?"
"Oh, she's no friend of mine. I was scared of her,"
said Mrs. Dearly.
"Yes, her hair was just the same. She had one white plait and one black."
Mr. Dearly thought how lucky he was to be married to Mrs. Dearly and not to Cruella de Vil. He felt sorry for her husband. Pongo and Mrs. felt sorry for her white cat. The golden sunset had gone now, and the blue twilight had come. The park was nearly empty, and a park keeper was calling, "All out! All out!" in a faraway voice. There was a faint scent of hay from the sun-scorched lawns, and a weedy, watery smell from the lake. All the houses on the outer circle that had been turned into government offices were now closed for the night. No light shone in their windows, but the Dearlys could see welcoming lights in their own windows, and soon Pongo and Mrs. sniffled an exquisite smell of dinner. The Dearlys liked it too. They all paused to look down through the iron railings at the kitchen. Although it was in the basement, this was not at all a dark kitchen. It had a door and two large windows opening onto one of the narrow paved yards which are so often found in front of old London houses. The correct name for these little basement yards is the area. A narrow flight of steps led up from the area to the street. The Dearlys and the dogs thought how very nice their brightly lit kitchen looked. It had white walls, red linoleum, and a dresser on which was blue-spotted china. There was a new-fashioned electric stove for cooking, and an old-fashioned kitchen fire to keep the nannies happy. Nanny Cook was basting something in the oven, and Nanny Butler stacked plates on the lift, which would take them up through the dining-room floor, as if delivering the Demon King in a pantomime. Near the fire were two cushioned dog baskets, and already 2 superb dinners in shining bowls were waiting for Pongo and Mrs.
"I hope we haven't tired Mrs.," said Mr. Dearly as he opened the front door with his latchkey.
Mrs. would have liked to say she'd never felt better in her life. As she could not speak, she tried to show how well she felt and rushed down the kitchen lashing her tail side to side. So did Pongo, looking forward to his dinner and a long firelit snooze beside his dear Mrs.
"I wish we had tails to wag," said Mr. Dearly.
Chapter 2. The Puppies Arrive. Cruella de Vil's dinner party took place in a room with black marble walls, on a white marble table. The food was rather unusual. The soup was dark purple, and what did it taste of? Pepper? The fish was bright green, and what did it taste of? Pepper. The meat was pale blue, and what did that taste of? Pepper. Everything tasted of pepper, even the ice cream, which was black. There were no other guests. After dinner, Mr. and Mrs. Dearly sat panting in the red marble drawing room, where an enormous fire was now burning. Mr. de Vil panted quite a bit too. Cruella, who was wearing a ruby satin dress with ropes of emeralds, got as close to the fire as she could.
"Make it blaze for me." "Lovely, lovely,"
said Cruella, clapping her hands with delight.
"Ah, but the flames never last long enough."
The minute they died down a little, she shivered and huddled herself in her absolutely simple white mink cloak. Mr. and Mrs. Dearly left as early as they felt polite, and walked along the outer circle trying to get cool.
"What a strange name de Vil is,"
said Mr. Dearly.
"If you put the two words together, they make devil. Perhaps Cruella's a lady devil. Perhaps that's why she likes things so hot."
Mrs. Dearly smiled, for she knew he was only joking, and then said,
"Oh dear, as we've dined with them, we must ask them to dine with us. And there are some other people we ought to ask. We'd better get it over before Mrs. has her puppies. Good gracious, what's that?"
Something soft was rubbing against her ankles.
"It's Cruella's cat," said Mr. Dearly. "Go home, cat. You'll get lost."
But the cat followed them all the way to their house.
"Perhaps she's hungry,"
said Mrs. Dearly.
"Very probably, unless she likes pepper,"
said Mr. Dearly. He was still gulping the night air to cool his throat.
"You stroke her a while I get some food,"
said Mrs. Dearly, and she went down the area steps and into the kitchen on tiptoe, so as not to wake Pongo and Mrs., who were asleep in their baskets. Soon she came up with some milk and half a tin of sardines. The white cat accepted both, then began to walk down the area steps.
"Does she want to live with us?"
said Mrs. Dearly. It seemed as if the white cat did, but just then Pongo woke up and barked loudly. The white cat turned and walked away into the night.
"Just as well,"
said Mr. Dearly.
"Cruella would have the law on us if we took her valuable cat."
Then they went down into the kitchen to receive the full force of Pongo's welcome. Mrs., though sleepy, was fairly formidable too. There was a whirling mass of humans and dogs on the kitchen hearthrug, until Mrs. Dearly remembered, far too late, that Mr. Dearly's dress suit would be covered with white hairs. It must have been about 3 weeks later that Mrs. began to behave in a very peculiar manner. She explored every inch of the house, paying particular attention to cupboards and boxes, and the place that interested her most was a large cupboard just outside the Dearlys' bedroom. The nannies kept various buckets and brooms in this cupboard, and there wasn't a spare inch of space. Every time Mrs. managed to get in, she knocked something over with a clatter, and then looked very ill-treated.
"Bless me, she wants to have her puppies in there,"
said Nanny Cook.
"Not in that dark, stuffy cupboard, Mrs. Love,"
said Nanny Butler.
"You need light and air."
But when Mrs. Dearly consulted the splendid veterinary surgeon, he said what Mrs. needed most was a small and closed place where she would feel safe, and if she fancied the broom cupboard she'd better have. And she better have it at once and get used to it, even though the puppies were not expected for some days. So out came the brooms and buckets, and in went Mrs., to her great satisfaction. Pongo was a little hurt that he was not allowed to go with her, but Mrs. explained to him that mother dogs like to be by themselves when puppies are expected. So he licked his wife's ear tenderly and said he quite understood.
"I hope the dinner party won't upset Mrs.," said Mr. Dearly when he came home and found Mrs. settled in the cupboard. "I shall be glad when it's over."
It was to be that very night. As there were quite a lot of guests, the food had to be normal, but Mrs. Dearly kindly put tall pepper grinders in front of the de Vils. Cruella ground so much pepper that most of the guests were sneezing, but Mr. de Vil used no pepper at all, and he ate so much more than in his house. Cruella was busy peppering her fruit salad when Nanny Butler came in and whispered to Mrs. Dearly. Mrs. Dearly looked startled, asked the guests to excuse her, and hurried out. A few minutes later, Nanny Butler came in again and whispered to Mr. Dearly. He looked startled, excused himself, and hurried out. Those guests who were not sneezing made polite conversation. Then Nanny Butler came in again. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said dramatically, "puppies are arriving earlier than expected. Mr. and Mrs. Dearly ask you to remember that Mrs. has never before been a mother. She needs absolute quiet." There was an instant silence, broken only by a stifled sneeze. Then the guests rose, drank a whispered toast to the young mother, and tiptoed from the house. All except Cruella de Vil. When she reached the hall, she went straight to Nanny Butler, who was seeing the guests out, and demanded, "Where are those puppies?" Nanny Butler had no intention of telling, but Cruella heard the Dearlys' voices and ran upstairs. This time she was wearing a black satin dress with ropes of pearls, but the same absolutely simple white mink cloak. She had kept it round her all through dinner, although the room was very warm, and the pepper very hot. I must see the darling puppies," she cried. The cupboard door was a little open. The Dearlys were inside, soothing Mrs. 3 puppies had been born before Nanny Butler, on bringing Mrs. a nourishing chicken dinner, had discovered what was happening. Cruella flung open the door and stared down at the 3 puppies. "But they're mongrels! All white! No spots at all!" she cried. "You must drown them at once!" "Dalmatians are always born white," said Mr. Dearly, glaring at Cruella. "The spots come later."
"And we wouldn't drown them even if they were mongrels," said Mrs. Dearly indignantly.
"It's quite easy," said Cruella. "I've drowned dozens and dozens of my cat's kittens. She always chooses some wretched alley cat for their father, so they're never worth keeping."
"Surely you'll leave her one kitten,"
said Mrs. Dearly.
"If I'd have done that, I'd be overrun with cats," said Cruella. "Are you sure those horrid little white rats are pure Dalmatian puppies?" "Quite sure," snapped Mr. Dearly. "Now please go away, you're upsetting Mrs." And indeed, Mrs. was upset. Even with the Dearlys there to protect her and her puppies, she was a little afraid of this tall woman with black and white hair who stared so hard. And that poor cat who had lost all those kittens. Never, never would Mrs. forget that. And one day she was to be glad that she remembered it. "How long will it be before the puppies are old enough to leave their mother?"
asked Cruella.
"In case I want to buy some." 7 or 8 weeks, said Mr. Dearly, "but there won't be any for sale."
Then he shut the cupboard door in Cruella's face, and Nanny Butler firmly showed her out of the house. Nanny Cook was busy telephoning the splendid vet, but he was out on another case. His wife said she would tell him as soon as he came home, and there was no need to worry. It sounded as if Mrs. was getting on very well. She certainly was. There was now a 4th puppy. Mrs. washed it, and then Mr. Dearly dried it, while Mrs. Dearly gave Mrs. a drink of warm milk. Then the pup was put with the other 3 in a basket placed where Mrs. could see it. Soon she had a 5th puppy, then a 6th, and a 7th. The night wore on. 8 puppies, 9 puppies. Surely that would be all. Dalmatians do not often have more in their first family. 10 puppies! 11 puppies! Then the 12th arrived, and it did not look like its brothers and sisters. The flesh, showing through its white hair, was not a healthy pink, but a sickly yellow, and instead of kicking its little legs, it lay quite still. The nannies who were sitting just outside the cupboard told Mr. and Mrs. Dearly that it had been born dead.
"But with so many, its mother will never miss it,"
said Nanny Cook comfortingly. Mr. Dearly held the tiny creature in the palm of his hand and looked at it sorrowfully.
"It isn't fair it should have no life at all,"
said Mrs. Dearly, with tears in her eyes. Something he had once read came back to Mr. Dearly. He began to massage the puppy. Then he tousled it gently in a towel. And suddenly there was a faint hint of pink around its nose. And then its whole little body was flushed with pink beneath its snowy white hair. Its legs moved. Its mouth opened. It was alive! Mr. Dearly quickly put it close to Mrs. so that she could give it some milk at once, and it stayed there feeding until the next puppy arrived. For arrive it did. That made 13. Shortly before dawn, the front door bell rang. It was the splendid vet who'd been up all night saving the life of a dog that had been run over. By then, all the puppies had been born, and Mrs. was giving breakfast to 8 of them, all she could manage at one time. "Excellent," said the splendid vet. "A really magnificent family. And how is the father bearing up?" The Dearlys felt guilty. They had not given Pongo a thought since the puppies had begun to arrive. He had been shut up in the kitchen. All night long he had paced backward and forwards, and only once had he heard any news, when Nanny Cook had come down to make coffee and sandwiches. She had told him that Mrs. was doing well, but only as a joke, for she had no idea he would understand.
"Poor Pongo! We must have him up,"
said Mrs. Dearly. But the splendid vet said that mother dogs did not usually like to have father dogs around when puppies had just been born. At that moment, there was a clatter of toenails on the polished floor of the hall, and upstairs, 4 at a time, came Pongo. Nanny Cook had just gone down to make some tea for the splendid vet, and the anxious father had streaked past her the moment she'd opened the kitchen door. "Careful, Pongo," said the splendid vet. "She may not want you." But Mrs. was weakly thumping her tail.
"Go down and have your breakfast and a good sleep,"
she said, but nobody except Pongo heard a sound. His eyes and his wildly wagging tail told her all he was feeling. His love for her, and those 8 fine pups enjoying their first breakfast, and those others in the basket waiting their turn. How many were there?
"It's a pity dogs can't count,"
said Mrs. Dearly. But Pongo could count perfectly. He went downstairs with his head high and a new light in his fine dark eyes, for he knew himself to be the proud father of 15. That's the end of our story for tonight. We hope you enjoyed. If you want to put your favorite story forward, our email is myslumbertales@gmail.com. Sleep tight.